What is an extremely dark, true story most people don't know about? Story 1. A 58-year-old man living alone in Japan started hearing noises at night and noticing things out of place in his house. He installed video cameras. Turns out a homeless woman had been living in his attic and cupboards for almost a year, undetected. This is why I get freaked out when I hear things at night. It gets creepier. The way he found out about the woman was that he sat down in his living room to review the tapes and saw the woman climbing into a cupboard and closing the door. The cupboard was right next to where he was sitting. Story 2. The Amy Bradley disappearance. She disappeared from a cruise ship en route to Curacao in 1998, and years later photos were emailed to her parents that very much resembled her and looked like she had been sold into slavery. Multiple people have also claimed to see her through the years. The Wikipedia page on her lists the sightings. There's an FBI missing persons report including sketches of people she was seen with in 2005. The whole story is just chilling and terrifying, but this part of the Wikipedia article particularly stuck with me. In 1999, an American sailor reported that he went to a brothel on Curacao and was approached by a young woman. She told him her name was Amy Bradley and asked him for his help. At this point, 2 men in the bar had escorted her upstairs. By the time the witness reported this to the police several months later, the brothel had burned down. Story 3. A girl who lives 3 hours away from me in Medicine Hat, Alberta, together with her boyfriend, her mother, father, and 3-year-old brother. She was released from juvie a couple years ago and now goes to the same university as me. Story 4. During World War II, an American airplane crashed near the Japanese island of Chichijima. There were 9 servicemen on board. 1 was rescued by an American submarine, and the other 8 were taken in by the Japanese. Don't want to go all into the details, but through some time and events, the Japanese ended up eating at those servicemen. But that's not even the weird part. The 1 serviceman who was rescued? That was George H.W. Bush. Google Chichijima incident for more details if you'd like. Story 5. When Vlad the Impaler was about to be invaded, he impaled hundreds of peasants on his country's border so that his attackers would see how ruthless he was. It worked, and the invaders turned around and went home. Historians believe Vlad's penchant for impaling stemmed from abuse from men while he was a boy. Also, he experimented with different methods of impaling. Through various orifices, and in his off time he would eat meals while watching people slowly dying on their spikes. Story 6. Once upon a time on Staten Island, there was an institute for the mentally disabled known as Willowbrook. Long story short, most of the patients were left unattended. In other words, it was a nightmare. Here is a short glimpse of what I'm talking about. Needless to say, that show was shut down. But that's only the beginning. Years later, a man by the name of Andre Rand, who was an old attendant of the facility, kidnapped 2 young girls, Holly Ann Hughes and Jennifer Schweiger. Rand was given the nickname Cropsy after an old urban myth of a forest-dwelling axe murderer. IIRC, the corpse of Holly Ann Hughes, was discovered in the surrounding woods, while Jennifer's corpse has yet to be found. There's actually a decent documentary about the whole thing on Netflix. Just search for Cropsy. Story 7. Centralia, Pennsylvania. It was a pretty decent-sized coal mining town, and in the 60s, a fire, which I believe started at a landfill, but was not put out completely, caught an exposed coal vein on fire, and the fire burns underground to this day. In the 80s, the government started paying people to leave and buying up all the land and destroying the houses so no one could live there. Since they didn't exactly force people to leave, the town still has a population of about 10. There's enough coal underground to keep the fire burning for a very long time. I've been there before, and in person, it is really eerie. It's a bunch of empty streets with 1 or 2 houses, a church, and some cemeteries. One part of the highway, which was closed off and rerouted because of the fire, is all cracked and misshapen, so the road is really uneven. One of the weirdest things is the steam that comes through the ground. It almost looks like hot springs everywhere, but it's really all coming from the fire below. It was also the graphic inspiration of Silent Hill. Story 8. I woke up at 7 years old, totally bare, with the sole window in my room open, screen placed outside propped up against the house. I have no memory of what may have happened or how I came to be barren in the middle of the night. I went to my mother, in my predicament, who rolled over and told me I was fine. I took her word for it, put some clothes on, and went back to bed. I still have no idea what happened. I do remember her putting the window screen back into its proper place the next day, and nothing else was ever said. Story 9. Nobody knows about this story, but I will tell you, Reddit. This is about my uncle. I think it was the late 70s or 80s. I can't remember which. But my uncle is old. He's like 50 now. Anyway, He took a trip to the Grand Canyon with his friends. They were driving along the Grand Canyon and stopped near an area with hedges and bushes on the side of the canyon and decided to take one of your standard, funny Grand Canyon photos. They had a really funny idea. My uncle was to stand on the side of the canyon with a fishing rod and pretend to fish off the side of the canyon. So they ended up taking the picture, and shortly after packed up and drove off. So they took the role to be developed, and when they saw the picture they noticed something very strange. In the picture, not far behind my uncle, was a man dressed in all black with pale white skin, standing there in the bush, just staring at the camera with a knowing smirk on his face. He said he and his 2 friends were in that spot for about 15 minutes. My uncle and his friends claimed that they did not know this man, that they were the only ones in this spot, and the Grand Canyon was vacant of tourists at this time of year. They still know nothing about the man, and the picture still exists. My dad took frequent trips to the Grand Canyon when he was younger, in the 70s. He tells me about one time, him getting to the rim and meeting a stranger who wanted to hike down with him. They hiked to the bottom, where after a 3-hour walk across rocky terrain, the stranger ate nothing, and then they started walking back up. At one of the switchbacks halfway up, the stranger disappeared. My dad never heard or saw anything happen. Maybe these things happen at the Grand Canyon. Maybe the guy in the picture was the stranger. Maybe my dad was on peyote and never even went to the Grand Canyon. Maybe I'm adopted. All I'm saying is, I love peyote. Story 10. My roommate's sister lives in a suburban part of Delaware, right outside of Wilmington. Her neighborhood has been experiencing all these weird break-ins for a bit. Break-ins where no one could figure out who had been taken, where no one could figure out what had been taken. Finally, one day she comes home and finds a pair of men's boxers on her pillow. To the skeptics, she lives alone. She immediately calls the police and gets the hell out of Dodge, locking her doors before she leaves. The police come back with her to her house and find the door unlocked, meaning the man was almost certainly inside her house when she made the discovery. Story 11. Gilbert Newton Lewis, the scientist who made the Lewis dot structure we all learn in chemistry, was nominated for the Nobel Prize 35 times, and won it 0 times. After having lunch with a rival who built off of his work, who won a Nobel Prize over him, Gilbert Newton Lewis went off into his lab and offed himself with the chemicals he was experimenting with. Story 12. The USS Indianapolis. Basically an American ship in World War II discovered parts from the first atomic bomb. On the return journey, it was torpedoed. Because the mission was classified, no one really knew where they were. The ship sunk, and the survivors all abandoned ship, wearing lifeboats. The men died of exposure, dehydration, and shark attacks. My grandfather was friends with a man who survived this, and used to talk about his story. The men all banded together in a circle, facing outwards. They couldn't see as far as their feet underwater, but they could see fins circling around them. They all had to keep kicking in front of them, in hopes of kicking sharks away. However, they would occasionally have the person next to them be dragged under the water, never to resurface. In addition to not being able to see the sharks around them, they often wouldn't know the person next to them was dead because of the life vests. The person would often still float. Oftentimes, one of the people whose arms were linked to the next person would roll over, to show they had been bitten off at the torso. When people finally realized they weren't back where they were supposed to be yet, and went looking, only 317 of the original 1,196 crewmen were still alive. Story 13. I've always thought the story of the children of Hamelin was pretty creepy. The town's records start in the late 1300s, with the line, "It is 100 years since our children left us." Basically, Hamelin is where the legend of the Pied Piper comes from. He was a guy who would go around to cities and have the mayor pay him to get rid of all the rats. He would then walk through the streets playing a flute, and all the rats would just follow him out of the city. One day, someone decided not to pay him for getting rid of the rats, so he came back at night, walked through the streets playing his flute, and all of the children followed him out of the town, never to be seen again. Obviously, that's not true, but it's based on the Children's Crusade. A boy gathered an army of children to retake the Holy Land. Hamelin is believed to have let their children go on the crusade because they were going broke or something. The army crossed the Alps, commissioned some ships in Venice, and the ships promptly took all the children to Tunisia, where they were sold into slavery. It's not the most what the f*** story, but I do think it's a little creepy that there was a city out there whose children just up and left. Story 14. UVB-76. It's a mysterious shortwave radio station in Russia that has been playing buzzing and beeping, which is occasionally interrupted by someone reading strange numbers and letters since 1982. On rare occasion, you can hear background noise, which leads many to believe that it's not a recording, but real people reading the numbers. The purpose of the station is completely unknown. Story 15. My parents' friends told me about a genuine, terrifying story that happened to someone at his work. His colleague at work, a woman in her mid-30s, was on holiday in Portugal with her family for the summer. Herself and her daughter were shopping in a supermarket close to the hotel. Just for a second to collect some groceries for the shelves, the mother lets go of the daughter's hand. The mother collects her things and begins to move to the next aisle. That's when she notices her child is missing. This took place shortly after the Madeleine McCann disappearance. And fully aware she was in a crowded supermarket, the mother flips out. She starts screaming for her child, that her child is missing, and is so distressed that the store freaks out with her. Shutters come down, alarms are sounded, and the staff begin a search for the girl. They found the girl still alive in the bathroom. Her hair had been cut and she was wearing a different set of plain clothes. If they had taken but a few seconds more to find her, she would have been gone for good. Thinking about it gives me chills. Story 16. The Fernard School and others like it was part of a popular American movement in the early 20th century called the eugenics movement. The idea was to separate people considered to be genetically inferior from the rest of society to prevent them from reproducing. I actually learned about this back in 2004 when I met a former youth who was experimented on, Fred Boyce. I would love for this to be noticed by a lot of Redditors. I met Fred when I was 14 in Massachusetts. I was at Dunkin' Donuts when he was alone, and I was with my uncle. My uncle must have known him because they started talking, and I was pulled into the conversation. I learned about what happened to him on all those boys at Fernald. He told me all the horrors that he had went through, etc., and I was in disbelief. It was so surreal to me. He then went on to explain that he had cancer and was on his last years left. He also mentioned that Steven Spielberg was planning on adapting the book The State Boys Rebellion into a film. He told me he could promise to get me cast as an extra. I remember feeling so excited about meeting Mr. Spielberg and being in a film. So after a couple of years of the film not fully done being produced or even filmed at all, Fred Boyce passed of cancer. He had received the disease from the experiments as a child. It is so sad, but it's reality. This is just one of most likely many hidden, dark secrets of America. Anyways, I thought I would share this with everyone. I find it all very interesting. Story 17. There was at least one guy, Kevin Korsgrove, on the phone with 911 operators on 9/11. He was on the phone and his call was being recorded as the tower collapsed. It's not for the faint of heart, and is one of the only things on the internet that has really chilled me to the core. It's not something people don't know about. Really, more like something no one really thinks about. There were people on the phone with others outside the towers as they collapsed, and those listening got to hear what happened. Story 18. The case of the Somerton Man is fascinating, if only because no one knows a damn thing about who this guy was, where he was from, or anything else about him. Some guy just turned up dead on a bench in Australia in 1948, with only a scrap of paper with nothing but the words "Tom and Should" and an uncracked code written on it. Story 19. I teach middle school English in Korea. One of my students was walking into her family's apartment complex when an old lady asked for her help lifting some things. The old lady then said she had more things in the car and asked for her help. My student was reluctant but agreed to help. When she got to the car, some guy pushed her in and another guy started driving off. She saw a hammer and some rope in the front seat. Luckily, she had the toe of her sneaker stuck in the door, so it remained slightly open. When the car slowed down on a turn, she jumped out and ran home. The old lady was still out front talking to the second guy, so she used the side entrance. Apparently this happens frequently. The children are kidnapped and have their organs harvested. Then they pour hydrochloric acid down their throats. It didn't faze her, as she was in class the next day chewing bubblegum. Story 20. More of a badass grandpa story, but still creepy. When my mom was little, she was at a park with my grandma and her sister. A man walked out of the woods into the park and grabbed a special needs girl and dragged her into the woods. Literally dragged. Everyone saw it and did nothing. And then my grandpa sprinted into the woods and found the man with the girl, who was kicking and screaming, and beat the ever-living crap out of him. A couple of men ran in to help my grandpa. My grandpa carried the girl to the park and drove her to the police, and the men take the kitty diddler to the police. I can't remember what happened to the man, but the girl was a mentally ill girl who had ran away from her house the day before. Story 21. You know what's really creepy? There are over 6,000 comments on this thread, and the odds are not insignificant that one of the people posting here might be part of their own creepy story. Story 22. A man disappears while fishing in the local reservoir. Authorities search, but can't locate the body. A month later, drivers find him when they're investigating an obstruction in the intake pipe for the drinking water system. His remains are stuck, and much of him has been sucked into the water supply. They released an official story that they had located the body. They didn't say where. What really happened? For at least a few weeks, the good townspeople had been drinking an interesting tea. Granted, it was purified, but tiny bits of protein and body fluids would have made it through the process. Story 23. I think the Stanford prison experiment was kind of creepy. It was intended to have given people roles as prisoners and prison guards, stay in a small area, a pseudo-jail for 2 weeks. After a few days, people were being locked in closets, a college student went on a hunger strike. The prisoners actually felt like prisoners, and the guards actually felt like guards despite being told at the beginning they could stop at any time they wanted. The organizer of the experiment, Philip Zimbardo, actually felt like a prison superintendent by the end of it. The experiment was shut off after 4 days because it was escalating so quickly. Zimbardo made millions off of his venerability in the psychology community. He did an AMA about a year ago. Story 24. Before the Soviets successfully launched a man into space, they had a lot of unsuccessful attempts. To make a long story short, there may be dead astronauts in Earth's orbit right now. If this is true, then their bodies are still perfectly preserved since they were launched about 5 decades ago. NASA managed to pick up some of the cosmonauts' last radio transmissions, and you can hear the last words in space before they perished. Story 25. K-129. In 1968, the KGB essentially hijacked one of the Soviet Navy's submarines with the intention of decimating Hawaii with a nuclear missile in order to ignite World War III by framing China. They were literally seconds away from succeeding too. The missile actually ignited. It's unknown as to what exactly happened, but it appears that they overlooked a little known failsafe that caused the missile to not only self-destruct, but destroy the boat and the entire crew of Soviet soldiers who appeared to have been attempting to regain control of their boat to stop them. The US Navy and CIA later found the wreck and raised the sub. Project Azorian. There's a documentary on Netflix about it, but I never knew about it being hijacked. I have to look into that.